George II was next in 1727. He spoke English, although with a very heavy German accent. But this allowed him to insult the food, arts, equestrian ability, and fashions of his English subjects, whom he despised. In the normal course of events, George II would have been succeeded by his unloved son, eldest son, the Prince of Wales, Frederick Lewis, whom he described as the greatest beast in the world. He went so far as to express the wish that Frederick Lewis could be removed from the line of succession. This was accomplished in 1751 when the 47-year-old heir to the throne died from an abscessed lung. Freddie Lou was an avid cricketer and tennis enthusiast. The unproven story has it that the abscess was caused when he was struck by either a cricket ball or a tennis ball, depending on whatever game he was playing that day. Next, we have George III, son of Frederick Lewis and his wife, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Goethe, next in the line of succession. He who would become George III was 22 years old when his grandfather died in 1760, putting him on the throne, but under control of his mother and her favorites. John Stuart, stylized Lord Bute, prime minister from 1762 to 63, whose popularity suffered more at home than in the colonies. Lord George Grenville, prime minister from 1763 to 65, and then Lord George Germain, Secretary of State for the American Colonies, 1775 to 1782. It takes a lot of Georges to mess things up. Now, this quote by Plum may not have been rooted in fact, as other sources say that by the age of 8, young George could read, write, and speak English and German, and was intelligent enough to hold competent political conversations with his country's ministers. As prime minister, Lord Grenville would author the Stamp Act and provide the young monarch and his mother with less than sage advice as to how to deal with the increasingly restive colonists. Same goes for Lord Germain. His policies would be behind a lot of what went wrong for the British leading up to and through the course of the Revolution. Meanwhile, Mama was constantly exhorting George to be a king. But it's unfair to blame it all on George III. Georges 1 and 2 had done their parts as well. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I present you with the Molasses Act of 1733. The first shadow of what would later become the Intolerable Acts, also called the Coercive Acts, fell in with the institution of the Molasses Act of 1733, which prohibited the colonies from purchasing molasses from the French and Dutch West Indies. Colonists weren't happy about this. They needed the molasses to make rum, and it was an integral part of the triangle trade of slaves, molasses, and rum. But they recognized that it fell within Parliament's trade regulating purview. Then we have the King's trees. This little gem was the creation of George II. The British were building a stronger navy, and the Navy needed strong, straight trees for masts. The Navy found that the white pines of New England were perfect. The Crown sent a royal surveyor and mast agent off to the woods to find suitable trees and mark them with the broad arrow to be set aside for use by the Royal Navy. In 1760, George III imposed tighter restrictions. Not only were the settlers to only use thinner, unmarked trees for use for home building, and particularly for floors, in many cases, they weren't even allowed to own the trees on their own land. You can imagine the reaction. It led to tree banditry. Fun fact, there's an urban legend that says if you take a tour of an 18th century home and see white floorboards, what you are in fact seeing is the colonial home builders' answer to that particular Crown edict. Truth is, white floorboards were just a status symbol. But by now, the boy king, at the urging of Mom and the coaching of her good friend George Grenville, was determined to be a king as Mama wanted. Time to bring those frisky colonials to heel. And so he would make use of a law enacted by his predecessor in 1755, and he would have custom officers issue writs of assistance. Writs of assistance required customs officials and provincial officers to locate and identify contraband, arrest anyone evading the Navigation Acts, granted Crown agents the authority to inspect warehouses and private homes without the nettlesome trouble of obtaining a warrant or court order. George III then further increased the burden of the Navigation Acts by turning them into actual taxation laws. This was anathema to the colonists. This had never before been done by any English crowned head. They, the colonials, saw this as the first act of taxation without representation, as they had no voice in the English Parliament. After almost 150 years, the colonists, who had always held themselves to be Englishmen, were now actively being treated as something other by their king. With the now strict enforcement of the writs of assistance, George III set himself not only against the colonists, but against his own prime minister, William Pitt, who felt it was not a good idea to antagonize the British colonists in North America. At a time when England and her colonies needed a strong unified government, George and his parliament were creating chaos. Between 1761 and 1770, and that included a 2-year vacancy period, good King George would go through 6 prime ministers, finally landing on Lord North as his 6th in 1770. Excuse me for a second. Also in 1763, one of the rewards that was supposed to go to the colonials who had served as provincial troops during the French and Indian War was to come from the newly conquered lands west of the Appalachian and Allegheny Mountains, taken by conquest from the French and their Indian allies. King George reversed that policy and tried for the pacification of the irritated native tribes in the aftermath of Pontiac's rebellion. Part of that policy included issuing an edict prohibiting by royal proclamation white settlement of lands beyond the proclamation line of the Appalachians. It was set to restore stability, although never intended to be a permanent ban. It also provided that any further white settlements, including the prohibition, was lifted, would have to come through negotiated treaties. Toward that end, New Yorker Sir William Johnson, Superintendent of Indian Affairs since 1756, was appointed chief negotiator. He was common law married to Molly Brant, a high-ranking Iroquois woman, which gave him considerable trail cred. Trail cred is what you get in the wilderness instead of street cred. In any event, Johnson managed to pacify one tribe after another and finally brought the rebellion to an end in 1766. As for the white folks, some got with the program. Some others didn't want to pay for the land and acquired it the old-fashioned way. They ignored the Proclamation Act and they just went and took it. Now, as I mentioned, Sir William Johnson took Molly Brant as a wife. They had a son, Joseph Brant, who during the American Revolution was a loyalist leader. And during the war, American Revolution and later actions, he would harry the colonials and never gave up his hatred of the Americans. That brings us to the Sugar Act of 1764. Unlike the original Navigation Acts, which were intended to be protectionist, the Grenville Acts, the Sugar Act of 1764, and Stamp Act of 1765 were purely intended for revenue raising at the expense of the Americans. The Sugar Act replaces the Molasses Act. It now allowed importation from the French Industrial West Indies, but taxed the imports. It also required that violation of the act would be tried by the Vice Admiralty courts, where there were no juries who might be sympathetic to the alleged smuggling wrongdoer. The American response was non-importation agreement instituted in Boston with a pledge of a boycott of a significant variety of British goods. What began in Boston was soon signed onto by a number of colonies. Also in 1764, they passed the Currency Act. It was a measure imposed on the 9 southern colonies outside of New England at the behest of English merchants and public officials who wanted the American colonists to pay their debts in hard currency, gold and silver, rather than the more unstable paper money or letters of credit issued by each individual colony. Parliament had similarly clamped down on New England in 1751, disallowing issuance of paper money, while the southern colonies continued to print paper money for payment of its debts after the French and Indian War. Even though precious metals like gold or silver were in short supply at the time in America, the act was not seen then as grievance-worthy, as it wasn't as extreme as the London merchants had petitioned for. However, beginning with the Stamp Act, it became symbolic of other crown dictates undermining the colonial institutions of self-governance. Fun fact, the whiskey rebels of Western Pennsylvania would, in 1791 through 94, hold a tax revolt over similar measures taken by the newly formed federal government. And that brings us to the Stamp Act of 1765. As you things are escalating. There's new stuff every year or two going on. Now, in 1765, Prime Minister Grenville doubled down with the Stamp Act, which was passed to help pay down the debt amassed during the French and Indian War, and the maintenance of garrisons of British soldiers who remained in the colonies after the Treaty of Paris. The act required for a government tax stamp to be affixed to a wide variety of material inclusive of newspapers, legal documents, patent medicines, checks of exchange, playing cards, and dice. And as was the case with the sugar tax, infringements were referred to the Vice Admiralty courts, and still no voice in Parliament. So not much joy there for the colonials. Even in Parliament, there was not universal agreement. Isaac Barre was the first to use the phrase Sons of Liberty in an anti-Stamp Act speech in Parliament. When Barre's speech was reported to Boston, Samuel Adams latched onto that turn of phrase for future use. Fun fact, one of Barre's fellow pro-American parliamentarians was John Wilkes. If you put them together, you get Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, named in their honor. Meanwhile, back in the colonies, battle lines began to be drawn between Whigs and Tories, angry citizens against customs agents and crown representatives, and pretty much anyone who held a grudge against anybody else. Patrick Henry pushed the Virginia Resolves through the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg when it really was colonial Williamsburg. And John Adams penned a Stamp Act protest called Instructions to the Town of Braintree, which became a model for other towns that objected to the tax. Also, in 1765, Parliament passed the Mutiny Act to improve discipline in the British military worldwide. It also included a provision that affected the civilian population, as it called for troops to be billeted in private homes at the owner's expense. The reaction in America was outrage. Guess who's coming to dinner and never going away? The result was that Parliament backed off to an extent. Now, rather than be housed in your house or my house, the colonies had to provide barracks and supplies, and also called for the troops to be housed in taverns and inns at public expense. 1766 brought about the Declaratory Act. Now, between the time of the death of Queen Anne and the end of the French and Indian War, England's handling of the colonies shifted from a hands-off, salutary neglect, allowing the establishment of domestic self-governance. This idea of self-government was peculiar to the English colonies as opposed to those initiated by the Spanish and the French, which were seen as extensions of the mother countries. The English colonies were established as semi-autonomous chartered companies who paid a percentage of their profits into the crown treasury. But as the 18th century progressed, each of these successive new measures by imperial thumb intended to create consternation on the part of the colonists, fearing a loss of whatever autonomy and self-rule they had so far enjoyed. The Declaratory Act, or as it was also known, the American Colonies Act, was imposed concurrently with the repeal of the Stamp Act and the lessening of the Sugar Act as a result of American boycotts against British importations. But the Crown felt it couldn't just simply acquiesce to American complaint, hence the Declaratory Act, which proclaimed that Parliament, quote, had hath and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. In concept, this allowed Parliament the absolute power to make laws, change laws in all cases against the colonial governments, even though the colonists were not represented in Parliament. Taxation without representation. Now, Charles Townshend was cynical, opportunistic, chronically contrarian, and unprincipled. And that's what his friends said about him. The Townshend Revenue Act imposed import duties on lead, glass, paint, tea, paper, and the taxes generated used to pay the expense of maintaining the military and pay the salaries of royal colonial officials. Then Townshend pushed through a new system of customs commissioners. Ostensibly, their job was to enforce the import duties, but they operated in a way that has been termed customs racketeering by the late historian O.M. Dickerson. Here's how it worked. Customs officials would approach their work in a very lackadaisical manner for an extended period of time. Then, without warning, they'd spring into action and crack down on the offenders, grab up the vessels and cargo, impose the duties plus large fines. They operated in kind of the same way an alligator lulls a deer into a false sense of security over a period of days before having the poor critter for lunch. Those who couldn't pay the onerous amounts had their ships and cargoes condemned and auctioned off. Either way, the money was collected. It was split three ways among the Royal Treasury, the Royal Governor, and the Customs Commissioner. The New York legislature refused to go along with the Quartering Act, so in 1767, Townshend suspended the New York State Assembly until they fell into line, which didn't happen until 1770. That same year, both Charles Townshend and the Townshend Acts expired. The Acts by decree, and Townshend from typhus. But he left a nasty legacy and a very bad taste in the mouths of those living on the west side of the Atlantic Ocean. The Tea Act of 1773. Things had just begun to settle down a little bit when they sprung this on him, and Parliament reinstated the tea on tax. This time it was not punitive, it was a government-instigated corporate bailout of the British East India Company, which had gotten itself into a financial bind. But what it lacked in cash, it more than made up for in product, tea. What the Tea Act allowed was for the British East India Company to sell its tea tax-free directly to retailers, while colonial tea merchants were forced to pay the tax on sale to vendors. Reactions were swift and loud, and then it all came to a head in December of 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. 1 year later, finally, the Intolerable Acts. Tensions between protesters and loyalists grew rapidly. Printing presses were smashed, custom houses raided, pillaged, and destroyed. Tarring, feathering, and being ridden out of town on a rail occurred with greater frequency. Parliament's response to all of this was to continually add fuel to the fire with a series of edicts called the Coercive Acts, dubbed by the Adams faction as the Intolerable Acts, some of which were aimed specifically at those fractious troublemakers in Boston. Massachusetts had its governmental powers rolled back. The upper chamber would have its previously elected membership replaced by royal appointees. The Quartering Act was extended. This opened the door for the permanent garrisoning of British troops in Boston for the purpose of squashing dissent at colonial expense. The port of Boston was closed. More local officials would be appointed by the crown. Jurisdiction of colonial courts reduced. Capital crimes would be tried in England, not in the colonies. Town meetings would be restricted to one per year, and the Quebec Act. Now, what the Quebec Act did was it took Western territories that the British had taken from the French, which include parts of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota, and made them part of the British Canadian province. It also granted religious freedom to Catholics and allowed Catholics to hold public office and restored their rule of law from British to French. The colonists just didn't know what to make of it. And probably the worst part of it was all these, not just the land being given over, but here we've got a very Protestant country, and the crown, a Protestant crown, is granting all of these liberties to Catholics. So how did they respond? Well, they did non-importation agreements and boycotted British goods. And not only did colonial men merchants do this, but there were groups of women that signed non-importation agreements of their own, for which they were mocked in the British press. In addition to the boycotts, they started committees of correspondence. This was the first time that colonies would start to begin thinking on a regional or national level about how to deal with the problems they were having with the crown, and letters were flying back and forth. This was followed up by committees of safety. Committees of safety were first organized in 1775, and they were given the authority to colonial officials to seize weapons and ammunition and stockpile them for use by the militias in case of impending hostilities with crown forces, which they were hoping would not happen, but they wanted to be prepared. And of course, eventually, it would lead to conflict at Lexington Concord and at Bunker Hill, and the Declaration of Independence, which was finally signed on August 2nd, 1776. That, of course, led to war, more fighting, more shooting, but there was still time for the British to commit one last blunder: the Staten Island Peace Conference. Now, open hostilities had already commenced. Excuse me. But there were factions within the British government and British military who entertained hopes of putting the dogs of war back in their kennels. George III grudgingly gave permission to the Howe brothers, Naval Commander Admiral Lord Richard Howe, and General William Howe, commander of His Majesty's troops in North America. They had hoped that they could bring about a peaceful resolution that would satisfy the colonists' tax grievances and still maintain parliamentary authority. Unfortunately, it was handled in a rather ham-fisted fashion without taking colonial sensibilities into consideration. The proposal letters addressed to Washington by the Howes, seeking accommodations, referred to him not as General Washington, but as Mr. Washington. Given his sense of gravity and dignitas, Washington refused to accept the letters as not being appropriately addressed. Dignity was a big issue for George Washington, as it was for many 18th century personages. And the legitimacy of the Continental Congress was not acknowledged. Additionally, the brothers Howe were granted authority only to grant pardons and amnesties, but not substantive concessions. Washington's response was that the colonists had not committed any fault, so no pardons would be required. Ultimately, a meeting was arranged at the Billop House in Tottenville, Staten Island, New York. In attendance were Admiral Lord Richard Howe for the Crown and Continental Congressmen John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge. It arose that the British would require dissolution of the Continental Congress and other steps the colonists would have to accede to, as well as to acknowledge parliamentary supremacy. Compensation to loyalists adversely affected by the war. Acceptance of Lord North's conciliatory resolution regarding self-taxation, which allowed that any colony which met its share for colonial defense and paid the salaries of royal officials would not be otherwise taxed. And a promise to further discuss colonial grievances. Howe's limited authority to grant concessions was not satisfactory to the Americans. The Americans' insistence on British recognizing colonial independence was a non-starter for the British. The meeting lasted 3 hours, although a fine claret was consumed. Now, those of you who've listened to my talks in the past know that I like to tell stories not about stuff, but about people as well. So I'd like to take like a 3-minute break, clear my throat, have something to drink. And when we come back, we'll take a look at things on a more personal level. Don't go away. Okay, so we're going to talk about some people. Some you've probably heard of, and some you probably haven't. And about how they reacted to these events. Okay. We'll begin with the apex of the Connecticut political pyramid. The family of John Trumbull, Connecticut's wartime governor. Head of family Jonathan Trumbull had graduated Harvard College in 1727 and been given a license to preach the gospel in Colchester, Connecticut. and became a merchant in 1731. He served as a delegate to the Connecticut General Assembly for 7 years, starting in 1733. He came along with the Molasses Act. I think they were part of a package deal. Speaker of the Connecticut House of Representatives from 1739 to 40, and appointed lieutenant colonel in Connecticut's militia in 1739. He married in 1735, and the year 1756 saw the birth of the last of their 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. He became deputy governor in 1766, the year after the Stamp Act. When Governor Pitkin passed away in 1769, Trumbull succeeded him and served as governor until 1784, the year after the Treaty of Paris ended the war. He is the only colonial governor to have his term of service begin before the war, extend through the war, and after the war. He lost after guiding Connecticut through the American Revolution and being a confidant and advisor to Washington. Ironically, he lost the popular vote in May of 1783. But the General Assembly had such faith in his leadership that the Assembly returned him to a final term. It's kind of like what the British did to Churchill. Hey, Winnie, thanks for winning the war. Now get out. As the state governor, Trumbull was in the perfect position to actively and aggressively support and advance the revolution. To be sure, Trumbull and his entire family embraced the revolutionary cause. As I said, Trumbull would become a supporter and confidant of Washington. His wife, Faith, would be his rock and his support for 45 years of life, fraught with more than the usual hardships of the day. As to their 6 children, all of them embraced independence from England, but not all would survive the war. The eldest son, Joseph, served as a captain in the 12th Connecticut Regiment before being elected to the state assembly. He was appointed as the first commissary general of stores and provisions for the then stylized United Colonies in July 1775. The stress of his position, characterized as, quote, the perpetual cares and fatigues, quote, end quote, of his office, would lead to his untimely demise in 1778. Jonathan Trumbull Jr. served multiple terms in the state legislature and would become Speaker of the House in 1788. Between 1775 and 1778, he filled the position of Deputy Paymaster General of the Northern Department of the Continental Army. Next, he was Comptroller of the Treasury of the United States in 1778 and 79, and ended the war as Secretary and an aide-de-camp to General Washington. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, household tasks and the day-to-day support of Governor Trumbull's wife, Faith, who died in 1780, fell to the 3rd son, David. Beyond that, his father entrusted him with the delivery of dispatches from the War Office Trumbull had established about 1/8 of a mile from his home in Lebanon. David had oversight of the transportation of provisions, and being skilled with firearms, David Trumbull saw to the acquisition of gun parts and equipment repair, and assisted both the commissary and quartermaster departments. Youngest son and future noted artist John Trumbull served as an aide-de-camp to General Washington early in the war. He resigned his commission in 1777 to study art full-time under Benjamin West in England. Seriously, what was he thinking? The son of a former royal governor, now in a state of rebellion, who had served as an aide-de-camp to an enemy general, thinks going to England during hostilities is a wise and profitable use of his time. Not surprisingly, he was arrested, imprisoned for treason, and was deported only after the intervention of some influential friends. 4 years after the cessation of hostilities, he was able to continue his studies to become the artist we all know and love today. Let's face it, you can't swing a cat in Washington, D.C. without hitting a Trumbull painting. Eldest daughter Faith had her own penchant for art and would inspire her brother John. 1766, she married Jedediah Huntington of Norwich, Connecticut. Faith was visiting Boston at the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill and awaiting the arrival of her husband's regiment. Her concern for her spouse, combined with the chaos and cruelties of war she observed firsthand, sent her into a state of unpredictable anxiety and depression. As a result, she took her own life on November 24th, 1775. The fourth child, youngest daughter Mary, married William Williams. Not a very creative naming convention in that family. But Williams was a resolute revolutionary and signer of the Declaration of Independence. They would have 3 children of their own. All in all, the Trumbull family survivors would transition from rebels to patriots with the 1783 Treaty of Paris. Now, the Huntington clan, whose family tree had spread its roots deeply into the soil of the Revolution. 3 Huntingtons, Jabez, Benjamin, and Samuel, would serve on Connecticut's Council of Safety, an emergency committee that would handle the day-to-day duties when the state legislature was not in session. Jabez Huntington was the head of the family at the time of the war. He served on the Council of Safety from 1775 to 79. He was promoted to Major General of the state militia in 1776 and took charge of the entire Connecticut force following the death of General Wooster at the Battle of Ridgefield in 1777. His son Jedediah was a graduate of Harvard and a noted member of the Sons of Liberty. He joined the Army in Cambridge in April of 75, 1 week after Lexington and Concord, and later marched with the Army to New York. He was appointed a colonel in the 8th Connecticut Regiment in 1775, then to the 17th Connecticut Infantry Regiment in 76, and 1st Connecticut Regiment in 77. He would be commissioned a brigadier general in the Continental Army and brevetted major general at war's end. As noted above, Jedediah Huntington would wed the daughter of Governor Trumbull. Ebenezer Huntington served at Lexington before being appointed first lieutenant in Colonel Willis's Connecticut Regiment. He served until the end of the war and is depicted as one of the officers in John Trumbull's painting, Surrender of Lord Cornwallis. Benjamin Franklin was not so fortunate with his family when it came to the issue of independence. If George Washington was the father of our country, then Benjamin Franklin was our brilliant but slightly weird uncle. Let's face it, normal people don't play with lightning. Still, you've doubtless seen some illustrated variation of the 1752 electricity experiment with Franklin and his son William. William is usually depicted as a tween or a teenager, but was in fact 21 years old at the time of the experiment and 44 years old at the time of Lexington and Concord. As a youth, William got to travel abroad. He accompanied his father on the latter's trip to Europe as agent for the Pennsylvania and Delaware colonies, or on behalf of his business associates. William served and fought in Albany as a captain in the American Regiment during King George's War of 1744 to 48, an offshoot of the Austrian War for the War of the Austrian Succession, and the third and fourth wars of the French in the first half of the 18th century. It seems the colonies were constantly being embroiled in European problems. Afterwards, he went to London to study law. He married in England as well. Better yet, thanks in part to efforts by his father, William returned from England in 1763 with a crown commission to take the post of royal governor for the colony of New Jersey, a post he held for 13 years. Unfortunately for the family Franklin, father and son chose opposing sides when it came to the revolution and the issue of independence. William felt himself an Englishman through and through, and thus duty-bound to support his king. William was placed under arrest in 76 by the Provincial Congress of New Jersey and was jailed at various locations in Connecticut. However, even as a prisoner, he was so loquacious on the cause of loyalism and managed to garner support for the loyalist cause due to his persuasive oratory skills. He was released in 1778 and escorted to New York City, then under British control. He attempted unsuccessfully to help raise a loyalist regiment. William Franklin was among the loyalists who left for England in 1782. Father and son exchanged a pair of letters instigated by William in 1784 that amounted to nothing. William hoped to achieve some degree of reconciliation, but his father was having none of it. Father and son met one last time in 1785 when Franklin Sr. made a stopover in England on his way back from France. However, that conversation went, they never reconciled. And I thought my family could hold a grudge. And now for more on the loyalist side. I know, loyalists, but hey, they were people too. The Jarvises of Danbury were among the loyalist families in largely rebel Danbury, and so very low on the popularity index. In 1775, 19-year-old Stephen Maples Jarvis was a young man with a strong desire to start a family. But unfortunately for Stephen, there were obstacles. His dear old dad disapproved of his heartthrob, Amelia Glover, the object of his desire. Sadly, not even Jarvis's memoir says what dad found so objectionable. So Stephen did what pretty much any 18-year-old would do in order to irk his father. Stephen ran off to join the army, the American army. Think about it. Even though he was a loyalist at heart, he joined the American army to annoy his father. I'm sure no one in this room or in this Zoom has ever done such a thing to their parents. No surprise then that Jarvis Sr. tossed him out on his ear. After serving in the rebel militia for a time, Stephen got his loyalist priorities straight and, with other young Tories, soon rode across the Sound to Long Island in the dead of night. He made his way to New York City and enlisted in the green-coated Queens American Regiment, otherwise known as the Queens Rangers. Jarvis fought bravely against the rebel forces in several battles and campaigns. He was fortunate enough to survive the war and find fettle. Meanwhile, back in Danbury waits Amelia Glover. Have you all forgotten about Amelia? Well, fortunately for this story, I haven't. In May of 1783, after 7 years of fighting, Stephen Jarvis, still in his Queen's Ranger uniform, returns home to Danbury to plan his wedding with his life, with Miss Amelia, unaware that the Tory-leaning Anglican clergy have all closed their churches and fled the area. Oh, and also that a good portion of Danbury is not at all happy to see him. Don't forget that Danbury had been raided, looted, and burned by the British in 1777. That his father had been allowed to stay in town unmolested was a minor miracle. Two things in Stephen's favor. He had been granted permission by the local military authorities to return to Danbury to marry. And he was provided the protection of a squad of American 2nd Dragoons. Still, Stephen was advised to, as they say in the Westerns, get out of town by sundown. Instead, the couple found a clergyman, and the happy couple were wed that night. The next morning, the sheriff showed up with a warrant for Jarvis's arrest. Excuse me. Jarvis scared him out of the house with dire threats and vile imprecations. Now, with the house surrounded by a sheriff's posse and a detachment of dragoons, the bridegroom stuck his head out a second floor window and tossed down $1, calling for someone to buy a bottle to drink to the bride's health, which was quickly done. Sometime during that day's festivities, Stephen changed out of uniform, and bride and groom slipped out of his father's house, bound for the home of a friend with whom he and Amelia found refuge. The Jarvises endured the sullen hostility of their neighbors until their daughter was born in 1784. A year later, they left for Canada and settled in Fredericton, named for the second son of King George III. They moved to Toronto in 1809, where they lived out their lives as loyal citizens of the Crown. Stephen was not the only member of his family to make the move to Canada. Stephen's cousin, William Jarvis, was born in Stratford, my original hometown, in 1756, son of the Stratford town clerk and a staunch loyalist who, like Stephen, enlisted in the Queen's Rangers. He moved to England after the cessation of hostilities, but returned to North America in 1791, having been appointed provincial secretary and registrar of Upper Canada, a post he filled until 1817. He first established his office in Niagara, but later moved to York, now Toronto, and the provincial capital of Ontario. Canada is riddled with the name Jarvis. Streets, rivers, lakes, towns, industrial corporations, and real estate companies. You can't swing a cat in Toronto without hitting something named for Jarvis. Fun fact, the cat had nothing to do with felines, but rather it's a reference to not having enough room to swing a cat of nine tails used to inflict corporal punishment. Now, here's another family story, one that illustrates the principle of the law of unintended consequences. Now, usually the unintended consequences has a negative impact on the parties involved. However, happily, in this instance, that was not the case. Reverend Samuel Adam Peters was a big-mouth troublemaker. He was born in Hebron in 1735, graduated from Yale in 57, and went to Britain, where he was ordained in the Church of England, and returned 3 years later to take up his post as a commissioned missionary and rector of Hebron's St. Peter's Church. He was opposed to severing ties with Mother England. He convinced the townspeople of Hebron to vote against sending aid or supplies to Boston during the British embargo of that port city. He set about making sure that every Church of England clergyman read a statement to their congregations against contributing to the support of the people of Boston. Peters, being also the clergyman for Hartford, convinced those citizens to also vote against aid, much to the embarrassment of Governor Trumbull, who shut down all town meetings as a result of Peters' actions. Not surprisingly, there's a backlash. The opposition, known as the Wyndham mobs, paid a couple of visits to Peters. The first visitation was to demand assurances that Peters had not corresponded with his English friends about his state of affairs. Giving satisfactory responses, he was left unmolested in that instance. The second visit came as a result of his publishing Resolves of the Town of Hebron, the ones that called for the denial of assistance to Boston. This did not go down well, and a near riot ensued, including the discharge of a firearm and some minor damage to Peters' property. The immediate result was the decision by Peters to flee, ironically, first to Boston and then to England in October 1774. Now, this brings us to the aspects of unintended consequences and family. 1787, while living in England, Peters made arrangements for the disposition of his American assets. These assets included his slaves, Caesar and Lois, who had taken the Peters surname from their master, and their 8 children who had been left behind to care for his property. Disposition arrangements were made, and this included the forcible apprehension of Caesar, Lois, and their 8 children by a slave trader. The family was bound, loaded on wagons, and sent to Norwich, Connecticut to be loaded aboard a ship and sent to South Carolina to be sold. The indignant residents of Hebron leapt into action. A plan was hatched. A false arrest warrant for the slaves was issued, which superseded the slavers' authority. The posse arrived to Norwich in time, and the Peters family was returned to Hebron and released. Although still technically slaves, after fulfilling a term of service, the entire family was declared emancipated from slavery and forever free. And they remained an active part of the community life of Hebron for many years thereafter. Consider what this says about the people of Hebron, that they thought the family of Caesar and Lois more than neighbors and friends, rather than merely the property of an absentee owner. And to finish off this segment, we have to understand that there had been a fundamental change in the relationship between Crown and colonies. Thank you, Captain Obvious. Someplace along the line, things had changed for the English in America. As we've seen, it didn't all happen at once, but slowly, inexorably, the dynamic between Crown and colony mutated. The reasons for these were manifold. There's the exercise of imperial power. Change came in part because the colonies settled under English monarchs by royal charter fell under the control of foreign kings, in this case, the Germans of Hanover, who had no field, no love, and no respect for their subjects, especially those at a 3,000-mile remove. The Crown's need to protect the business interests of the East India Company and English domestic manufacturing and production are just 2 examples. England had evolved a strong mercantilist system, and the colonies had become a cash cow. Add to these the changing face of the American colonists and the attitudes born from their physical distance from the seat of authority. After 150 years of settlement, the spirit of the new continent had begun to infect the settlers with a new sense of freedom, of space, of room to breathe far away from mom and dad, like a kid in college. Don't sell that short. As the pressure mounted, people, individually and collectively, began to resort to their pens. Committees of correspondence popped up, and communication regarding grievances were shared from colony to colony. There was an equal amount of ink used in defense of staying loyal to the English government and its crown head. The 2 sides accounted for about 2/3 of the population of the 13 breakaway colonies. There was another third, a third which just wanted to be left alone to live their lives. As we know from history, that was just not going to happen. And a final irony. Not only were the taxes the colonists complained about less than the taxes that burdened the citizens of England, in the aftermath of the war, the government in America was forced to tax its citizens greater amounts than those that led to revolution. Here's a fun fact. A gentleman by the name of George Washington was not above complaining about the English-made goods he received through his British brokers in London. It seems the merchants and suppliers in Old Blighty were not reticent about shipping substandard goods and previous year's clothing rather than the more up-to-date fashions that he had ordered for himself and Martha. Kind of like product dumping today. Of course, it's not on the same order as when we received poison products and toxic toys from China, but even 250 years ago, customers expected to get what they paid for. George wrote his representatives in London to cut off the usual suppliers if they didn't get their act together. My words, not his. So this brings us to the end of this chapter of the Rise to Revolution. I'm working on other segments on the War for Independence and those involved, in addition to the ones you've already heard me give. But I hope you will come back and join me for those stories. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks so much, Eric. Can I ask something? It's going to be a stupid question, so bear with
Go
me.
ahead.
But I always get confused with the Georges. And the George you talked about, is that the crazy George, George III? You know, the
George
madness of?
III is the one who was suffering porphyria.
Right.
Yeah.
He didn't die of that though, right?
It was a contributing factor.
Contributing factor. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were a lot of symptoms. Well, there were other symptoms other than the periodic bouts of madness.
Yeah.
There were stomach ailments and other physical aspects to it that led to that. If it was not the direct cause, it was a very heavy contributing factor.
Yeah.
But hey, he got a play out of it.
Oh, and a movie, yeah.
And a movie.
Yeah, I've always thought it was kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any questions out there from anybody. You can unmute yourself. Feel free to ask Eric before we say goodbye. Anything? You must have done everything right, Eric. If no one has
Either that or I've put them all to sleep and they're not conscious enough to ask questions.
We didn't lose a person. I consider that a success. So
Actually, we added a person, so that's a good sign there.
very good.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And if nobody has any questions, thank you all for tuning in. And we'll see you on May 2nd when Hamish Lutris will be talking about the, what was it? The terrible portents which appeared over Northumbria.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Now that sounds interesting.
Yes, it is. Yes.
When was that?
I'm sorry?
When was that?
Oh, that was, I think, around 700 or 800 CE, and it was the Vikings that attacked the area.
Okay.
That's in the same area as that monastery of Lindisfarne, if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Lindisfarne.
Lindisfarne.
I'm sorry?
Lindisfarne.
Lindisfarne, that's the one, yes. And he also has a subsequent talk on the following weekend, the Vikings in Ireland. So those should be two very interesting talks. So I hope you can join us.
I do too.
Okay.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you so
Hi,
much, Eric.
Suzanne.
Welcome. Thank you all. Bye now.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you.